What if the oldest monument in Egypt isn't Egyptian at all? What if the Great Sphinx, that enigmatic guardian of the Giza Plateau, is whispering secrets in a language older than hieroglyphs, older than the pharaohs, older than civilization itself? This video explores alternative theories about ancient history, and what I'm about to share with you challenges everything mainstream archaeology has taught us about the dawn of human civilization.
Standing here in the shadow of the Sphinx, I'm struck by an overwhelming sense of time. Not the time measured in decades or even centuries, but time measured in millennia. Deep time. Geological time. The kind of time that reshapes continents and drowns entire worlds beneath rising seas. The Sphinx sits here, weathered and ancient, its leonine body carved from the living bedrock of the Giza Plateau, its human head gazing eternally toward the rising sun. According to mainstream Egyptology, this monument was constructed around 2,500 years before the Common Era, during the 4th dynasty reign of Pharaoh Khafre. The dating is based on historical records, on the architectural style consistent with other Old Kingdom monuments, and on the proximity to Khafre's pyramid. It's a tidy story, neat and contained within the comfortable boundaries of established chronology. But there's a problem with that view. A profound problem that emerges not from the study of ancient texts or hieroglyphic inscriptions, but from the stone itself. The evidence is carved into the very walls that surround the Sphinx, written in a language that predates human writing. It's written in patterns of erosion, in the vertical fissures that cut deep into the limestone, in the undulating weathering profile that speaks of forces the desert has not known for thousands upon thousands of years. This evidence suggests something extraordinary, something that, if true, would completely overturn our understanding of when and by whom this monument was created. In the early 1990s, a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch was invited to Egypt to examine the Sphinx. Schoch wasn't an Egyptologist, he wasn't an archaeologist. He was a geologist, a scientist trained to read the story that rocks tell about the passage of time and the forces that shape our planet. When Schoch examined the Sphinx enclosure, the deep trench carved into the bedrock from which the Sphinx itself was hewn, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. The weathering patterns on those enclosure walls were unmistakable. They were characteristic of erosion caused by water, not the occasional rain showers that the Giza Plateau experiences today, but sustained intense precipitation over thousands of years. The evidence is compelling. Look at these walls. You can see the deep vertical fissures, the result of water flowing down the limestone face, selectively eroding the softer layers while leaving the harder bands proud. You can see the rolling, undulating profile, the kind of parabolic weathering pattern that geologists associate with prolonged exposure to rainfall. This isn't the work of wind and sand, which creates a very different morphology, abrading the surface horizontally and leaving a smoother, more uniform appearance. This is the signature of precipitation, of sheet flooding, of water-carrying suspended sediment that chemically and physically attacks the carbonate rock. If this geological evidence makes you question what you've been taught about ancient Egypt, you're not alone. Join me on this investigation by subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to uncover. Now here's where it gets interesting. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced the kind of sustained, heavy rainfall necessary to create this degree of weathering was at the end of the African humid period. And even that period, which ended around 7,000 years before the Common Era, may not have been wet enough or long enough to account for what we see. To find a climate wet enough to cause this magnitude of erosion, we need to go back much further. We need to go back to a time before the Sahara became a desert, to a time when North Africa was a land of savannas and lakes, of rivers and rain. We need to go back to before the younger Dryas, to 10,000, 12,000 years before the Common Era, or even earlier. If Schoch is correct, and I believe he is, then the Sphinx predates the Egyptian civilization that supposedly built it by thousands of years, perhaps by as much as 7,000 years or more. This calls into question everything we've been taught about the timeline of human development, about the rise of civilization, about our own story as a species, we're forced to confront the possibility that the Sphinx is a remnant of something far older, something that has been lost to history. Mainstream Egyptology rejects this interpretation, of course. The establishment argues that the weathering could be explained by other means, perhaps by occasional rain in a desert climate, which can be surprisingly erosive, or by groundwater seepage, or by the inundation of the Nile. But these alternative explanations don't hold up to geological scrutiny. The pattern is distinctly that of precipitation-driven erosion. The Nile inundation never reached the elevation of the Sphinx enclosure. Groundwater doesn't create vertical fissuring. Wind erosion doesn't create the morphology we observe. When you show these weathering patterns to geologists without telling them where they're from, without revealing that they're looking at the Sphinx, they consistently identify them as the result of water erosion over extended time periods. There's another piece of evidence that supports a much earlier date for the Sphinx, and it comes not from geology, but from astronomy. The Sphinx faces due east, perfectly aligned to observe the rising sun at the equinoxes. Now, due to the precession of the equinoxes, that slow 25,920-year wobble of the Earth's axis, the constellation that rises heliacally at dawn on the spring equinox changes over time. In 2500 before the Common Era, when mainstream Egyptology tells us the Sphinx was built, the constellation rising at the spring equinox was Taurus, the bull. If the ancient Egyptians built the Sphinx as an equinoctial marker during the 4th dynasty, why did they give it the body of a lion? The Egyptians had powerful bull symbolism. They worshipped Apis, the sacred bull. Why not create a bull-headed monument? But if we wind the clock back, if we use astronomical software to calculate which constellation was rising at the spring equinox 10,500 years before the Common Era, we find something remarkable. At that time, the constellation rising heliacally at the equinox was Leo, the lion. The Sphinx, with its leonine body, may have been constructed as a terrestrial marker of the age of Leo, a monument designed to capture in stone the astronomical moment when the sun rose in the constellation of the Lion on the spring equinox. This astronomical correlation, combined with the geological evidence, paints a consistent picture of a monument far older than conventional chronology allows. Consider also the proportions of the Sphinx itself. The head is noticeably small in relation to the body. This disproportion has long puzzled Egyptologists. One explanation is that the head has been recarved, that the original leonine head was later reshaped into a human face, possibly that of Khafre or another pharaoh. If this is true, it would explain why the head shows less weathering than the body. The recarving would have removed the heavily eroded outer layers, leaving a fresher surface. It would also explain the disproportionate size. You can only make a sculpture smaller through recarving, not larger. If the Sphinx originally had a fully proportioned lion's head, and that head was later reduced and reshaped, the current head-to-body ratio would make perfect sense. So we're looking at a monument that geological evidence suggests is at least 12,000 years old, possibly older. A monument aligned to the age of Leo. A monument that may have been partially recarved and claimed by later Egyptian dynasties. But who built it originally? If it predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, who had the knowledge, the organizational capability, the vision to create such a structure? This is where the evidence leads us into deeper, more controversial waters. I've long argued that we are a species with amnesia, that we've forgotten a vital part of our own story. I believe that before the great cataclysm that ended the last ice age, before the Younger Dryas period brought dramatic climate change and rising seas, there existed an advanced civilization. Not advanced in the sense of iPhones and space shuttles, but advanced in terms of astronomical knowledge, architectural capability, and perhaps most importantly, a deep understanding of the sacred, of humanity's place in the cosmos. This lost civilization, I believe, was largely destroyed during the cataclysmic events of the Younger Dryas, roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. The evidence for these catastrophic events is now overwhelming. We know that massive floods inundated vast areas of the planet as the ice sheets melted. We know that sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, drowning coastal settlements and river valleys where early civilizations might have thrived. We know that the Sahara region, including the Giza Plateau, experienced dramatic changes in climate during and after this period. Perhaps the Sphinx was created by survivors of this lost civilization, or perhaps it was built by those who inherited knowledge from them. The monument may have served as more than just an astronomical marker. It may have been a memorial, a testament in stone to a world that had been lost, a deliberate message sent forward through time to future generations. Build something so massive, so enigmatic, so aligned with cosmic cycles that it would endure through any catastrophe. Make it speak in the universal language of astronomy and geology, languages that would be understood by any sufficiently advanced future civilization. The establishment tries to dismiss this evidence. They tell us that it's just erosion, just weathering, that we're reading too much into natural processes. They tell us that the lack of contemporary inscriptions means the Sphinx must be from the 4th dynasty, when it first appears in historical records. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Sphinx may have stood for thousands of years before it was incorporated into Egyptian royal iconography. The lack of Old Kingdom inscriptions on the Sphinx itself proves nothing about when it was originally carved. What we're seeing at Giza is not just a monument. We're seeing a mystery that spans millennia, a puzzle whose pieces are scattered across disciplines, from geology to astronomy to mythology. The ancient Egyptians themselves recorded that their civilization was built on the ruins of something older. They spoke of the first time the Zep Tepi when the gods walked the earth. We dismiss these accounts as myth, as religious fancy, but what if they're memories? What if they're garbled, mythologized recollections of an actual historical period, of a time when a now-forgotten civilization achieved heights that seemed godlike to those who came after? The water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure tells us something profound. It tells us that this monument witnessed rains that the desert hasn't known for 10,000 years or more. It tells us that the accepted timeline of civilization, the comfortable narrative that places the first complex societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 5,000 years ago, is incomplete. There's a missing chapter in our story, a lost epic that we're only now beginning to glimpse through the mists of deep time. Beneath the gaze of the Sphinx, time erodes not just stone, but certainty. The patterns carved by water tell a story no dynasty dared to remember, or perhaps couldn't remember, because the knowledge had been lost in the flood, scattered with the survivors who brought only fragments of their advanced understanding to seed the younger civilizations that would follow. Standing here as the sun sets over the Giza Plateau, as the last light turns the limestone gold, and the shadows deepen in those vertical fissures worn by ancient rains, I'm reminded of why I do this work. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm a journalist, an investigator, someone who asks uncomfortable questions and follows the evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence leads to a conclusion that mainstream archaeology finds threatening, that human civilization is far older and far more complex than we've been taught, that we've forgotten something incredibly important about who we are and where we come from. If the Sphinx has sparked your curiosity about what else we've forgotten, hit that like button. It tells me you want to keep digging into these mysteries with me. The Sphinx sits here, silent witness to ages we can barely imagine, guardian of secrets that geology is only now allowing us to read. It reminds us that the past is not a closed book, that new evidence can and should reshape our understanding. It challenges us to think bigger, to consider that our ancestors were not primitive, that they possessed knowledge and capabilities we've only recently begun to appreciate. So where does this investigation lead us next? If the Sphinx is a remnant of a lost Ice Age civilization, what other evidence might exist? What other monuments might bear the fingerprints of this forgotten world? The answer, I believe, lies in the flood myths that exist in virtually every culture on Earth. These myths speak of a great deluge, of civilizations drowned beneath rising waters, of survivors who preserved knowledge and brought it to new lands. Half a world away from Egypt, beneath the waters of the Mediterranean and beyond, beneath the waves that rose as the ice sheets melted, there may be evidence of the cities and settlements of this lost civilization. We're looking in the wrong places because we've been told to look in the wrong time period. We need to search the continental shelves, the areas that were dry land 12,000 years ago but are now submerged. We need to investigate the flood myths not as religious allegory, but as historical memory. Perhaps it was not built to face the sun, but to remind us of the floods that once erased the world. The Sphinx may be trying to tell us something, if only we have the humility to listen, the courage to question what we think we know, and the wisdom to recognize that our amnesia as a species runs deeper than we ever imagined. The water that carved those fissures is long gone, evaporated into the desert air or absorbed into the ground, but its message remains. Look deeper. Question everything. Remember what you've forgotten. And that journey of remembering, that quest to recover our lost history, continues in places that defy explanation, in myths that may be memories, in monuments that bear the traces of a world we've forgotten. The story of the Sphinx is not just about one monument in Egypt. It's about what happens when we dare to challenge consensus, when we allow evidence to guide us rather than dogma, when we acknowledge that the past is far stranger and more wondrous than the textbooks suggest. The water that carved these fissures into the Sphinx didn't just vanish. It rose. It covered the world. And now, after decades of searching, we may have found where it came from. Next time, Atlantis, not the myth, the evidence. Geological proof of a global flood that struck exactly 11,600 years ago. The same flood that every ancient culture remembers, the same flood that may have drowned the civilization that built what we see here. The stones remember, and the water. The water left its signature everywhere,